Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Jennifer Leonard, and I'm the Executive Director of the Future of the Profession Initiative, or FPI. FPI is an endeavor hosted at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School that focuses on a rapidly changing legal landscape and applying an interdisciplinary approach to spark innovation, promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and elevate attorney health and well-being. Today is the first session in a three-part series focused on learning how other disciplines approach similar challenges. Today, we'll focus on how other professions use human-centered design to innovate. In our second and third sessions, we'll learn from others about approaches to improving employee health and well-being and to promoting diverse and inclusive work environments. Before we dive into the great conversation we've planned for all of you today, a few housekeeping items. To submit a question, please use the Q&A feature found on the ribbon at the bottom of the window. You can upvote any questions that you'd like the guest experts to answer. We'd appreciate you keeping your questions topical and appropriate. Anyone posting inappropriate language or content will be removed. If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE codes will be presented twice per hour. Write down these codes and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. Please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat. These codes will tell us how long you attended. Here's the first passcode, DESIGN, D-E-S-I-G-N, design. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator for this afternoon's program, Jim Sandman. Jim is Senior Consultant to the Future of the Profession Initiative and a distinguished lecturer here at Penn Carey Law School. Jim is President Emeritus of Legal Services Corporation, the largest funder of civil legal aid programs in the United States, and he's also the former managing partner of the distinguished global law firm of Arnold & Porter. And of course, Jim is an esteemed alum of this law school. Thank you, Jim. I'll turn it over to you to introduce our guests and frame our conversation this afternoon.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. The premise for our spring series of webinars is that law can learn a lot from other disciplines. This session focuses on what we can learn about innovation. Innovation is essential to improving service and outcomes for customers, patients, clients, and users for anyone a profession or an industry serves. There are basic tools of innovation that can be deployed in many disciplines. One discipline can learn a lot from another about how to innovate successfully. We're going to home in on one of those tools today, human-centered design. We have three experts on human-centered design with us. First is Mike Avery. Mike teaches digital fabrication courses at Penn's Weitzman School of Design. He founded and operates DraftWorks, a design studio and fabrication lab focused on bridging the divide between the field of design and the act of fabrication. His academic training is in architecture. Marian Leary is Director of Innovation at Penn Nursing. She currently teaches the Innovation in Health Foundations of Design Thinking course. Marian's research has focused on cardiac arrest and CPR quality with the goal of developing strategies to improve bystander response and CPR training. Sarah Rottenberg is adjunct assistant professor in Penn's Weitzman School of Design. She's also executive director of the Integrated Product Design program at the University of Pennsylvania, a master's program that brings together design, business, and engineering to develop new products and experiences. She's also the faculty director of the Executive Program for Social Innovation Design, a certificate program at the intersection of design and social change. We have three goals for this afternoon's program. First, we're going to explain what human-centered design is and how it applies to many kinds of problems. Second, we'll explore the interdisciplinary nature of human-centered design. Third, we'll identify challenges to the adoption of human-centered design across industries and professions and how to overcome them. When we're done, we hope you'll see that law can learn from human-centered design. I'm going to start with Sarah and ask her if she could define what human-centered design is and what its steps are.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm excited to be here. So human-centered design is really a creative problem-solving process. It's a tool that designers and often non-designers can use to come up with new solutions to potential opportunities or potential challenges that they might identify. And there's maybe two ways of thinking about it that might be useful. So one is we really look to generate ideas that are at the intersection of desirability, feasibility, and viability. So we're trying to figure out what's desirable, what's meaningful, what matters to people, but also what can be feasible from a deployment perspective. Sometimes that means technologically feasible, sometimes that means organizationally feasible. And then also looking for ideas that are viable, right? What can we deliver sustainably over the long term and still like meet the organizational goals, whether that's our funding that we have or creating a profitable business. And then another way of thinking about this, though, I guess it's useful to say, like when I talk about design, my students usually design physical products and digital products. But I think the reason that human-centered design can be really valuable for a broader audience is that we all design. Design is a lot more than just like a website or a logo or what a room looks like or even what a house looks like. It's about what are experiences that we're creating with purpose. So we design meetings, we design onboarding systems, we design client engagements. And so I think because of that, these tools are really useful across a wide range of disciplines. And if you Google human-centered design or design thinking, you'll find a number of different ways of describing the process that we use, but they all have a few kind of key components in common. The first is starting with empathy. So really identifying who are your stakeholders and what can we do to build empathy with them so that we can understand a situation from their perspective so that we really are truly addressing their needs. And then the next is opportunity definition. And so that's saying, okay, we know all of this stuff about the people who we're designing for, but how do we really specify, what's the design opportunity? What's the challenge we can really focus our efforts on? And then the next step is idea generation. So we have a bias towards generating as many ideas as possible to any solution. And the theory there is that the more ideas you have, the better ideas you have. So we have all these tools for having a lot of ideas. And then we know that our ideas are really only hypotheses for what might work in the real world. So we do a lot of prototyping and testing those ideas to try to come up with what's a quick, cheap way of putting something out there, seeing if it works the way that it works, if it hits that, desirable, feasible, and viable as early as possible so that we can refine it and iterate. And so anytime you hear someone talk about human-centered design, you'll probably hear those words: empathy, opportunity definition, idea generation, prototyping, and iterating.
Sarah, I noticed that you use the term human-centered design. You often hear the term user-centered design. Are you choosing your words deliberately?
I am. So user-centered design is a way that the field is often talked about, but I don't really like it because I feel like if you're talking about me as a user, you're talking about me in relation to the thing that you care about, which is the product that you're designing or whatever you've created. But if you talk about me as a human, you're talking about me as a whole person. And you're not just paying attention to this narrow sliver of how am I interacting with the thing that you created. It's a much broader perspective. And I think it's important for us to understand that anyone that we're interacting with is, as you guys know in practice, right? Your clients have a lot more going on than just being your client. And I think it's the same thing for users and humans. So, and I do think that like the way that we talk about people starts to frame the way that we think about them and interact with them. So I think that's an important distinction.
You've described human-centered design as an approach to problem solving. People who've heard of human-centered design often associated with technology like smartphones. Can the three of you give some examples of human-centered design outside of technology to make concrete the range of problems that this discipline can be applied to?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. First, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. So yeah, I mean, exactly to your point, sometimes I think innovation and people think innovation is synonymous with technology or that design is synonymous with technology, and it's not. You know, innovation means many things to many different people, and we define innovation as not just technology, but the methodologies we use to solve problems, the systems and processes we create, and the way that we educate our students, communicate with our patients and their families. All these things can be innovation. And so at Penn Nursing, like you mentioned, Jim, I teach a course called Innovation in Health Foundations of Design Thinking. And our students often are designing process innovations, communication innovations, and products that aren't necessarily technologies. So for example, I had a group of students last semester who wanted to examine the topic of young millennials who were experiencing irritable bowel syndrome and how they could potentially help those young millennials get through their day. And so they designed a undergarment that was both odor and odor absorbent and was able to be disposed of if they were out, running with their dog or at a bar, and could be replaced easily. And so it was not a technology, but they were looking at a product that could be created for that population. I've also had other students who were looking at, like I said, communications innovations. So there's a group of clinicians at the Hospital University of Pennsylvania, as well as faculty at Penn Nursing, who wanted to address the problem of food insecurity in low-resourced postpartum women. And so they wanted to see how they could come up with a process/communication innovation to help these women figure out, once they're discharged from the hospital, how they could access this food pantry at the hospital for postpartum women. And so we're using the human-centered design process right now to do this contextual inquiry, to understand the problem from the point of view of these women, to really figure out what the pain points are, how they could best communicate this new resource that's being created of this hospital-based food pantry, and then have the women get access to this post discharge from having a baby. Because what happens right now is women get discharged, they only have one follow-up appointment, and after that, they're lost to the system. And so how do we continue to support these low-resource women once they get discharged from the hospital? And really the only way that you're going to understand this process and understand the problem in the context of where it's happening for these women is by using the empathy phase, doing interviews, observations, and really understanding the problem from, again, the point of view of the end user.
As you described, I'm glad you mentioned empathy, because I was making a connection between what you said and what Sarah said about the importance of empathy in human-centered design. It sounds to me like a variation on what used to be called bedside manner. Am I right?
Yes, but I think to Sarah's earlier point, like, in the health system, we have something called patient-centered care, right? But we're all patients are humans, and there's a lot going on outside of the four walls of a health system that affect the way that patients interact with the health system, both while they're in the hospital and then when they leave the hospital. And so as clinicians, as designers, we need to understand the full breadth and depth of what's going on in somebody's life to be able to accurately create a solution that meets their needs. And you can't do that if you're only looking at one small point in time or one experience that they're having. You have to really understand it, again, in the context of where their life occurs. And so I think that's sort of the difference between patient-centered and human-centered. And also, bedside manner. Yes, we should all have empathy, but we need to consider the bigger context of it.
Got it. So human-centered design in nursing goes way beyond the bedside.
human-centered design in any field should go way beyond the bedside or the courtroom or the design studio, wherever you're doing your practice.
Mike and Sarah, do you have some illustrations of the use of human-centered design beyond technology that might make the concept more concrete for a lawyer audience?
Yeah, so I can jump in. So in addition to the bio you provided, and thank you for having me as well, I also actually teach with Sarah in the IPT program. And last semester, we had a group of students actually jump right into the legal world by looking at Philadelphia court system and actually the spaces in which justice is provided, the courtroom itself. So just like we need to understand the person outside the one encounter, we can also understand a space from multiple angles, right? You have different parties in the courtroom. You have different people thinking they're coming there to do different things. And by actually taking a view of the courtroom in a new and fresh way, these students were able to provide insights to, the judges who invited us graciously into their space, the city hall itself, and really take a big view of what's going on here and actually providing very low tech solutions that were not geared towards anything but helping everyone in that space complete a shared task, which is listening, focusing, and providing justice for those who are coming in. One example that I think was interesting to everyone was the idea of the portraiture in the space, right? So when you're looking around, you really need to be in the space. You really need to take the view of the person who is there. And what was noticed as they went through mock trials and iterated on their design is that for the jury, oftentimes the face of the person, which is often an older judge, right, who is no longer working, is bigger than the actual judge's face in the room. So as you're sitting there as the jury, you're surrounded by 4 or 5 huge faces, but the person who you should be looking at the most is actually smaller and further away from you. And only by sitting in the jury box, only by thinking about it from multiple angles would that insight have come up. And it was news to basically everyone in the room that that was actually impacting the way the jury saw the trial. So I think we can bring it to any profession as long as we root it in, again, the people, the places, and the processes they're going through.
It's really interesting. Can you say more about the particular people you thought about in this courtroom design exercise? You just mentioned jurors.
Yeah.
But what about parties? The one thing I'm particularly interested in is a phenomenon that's very widespread in the courts of the United States today. Cases where the majority of the people appearing in court don't have lawyers. Mm-hmm. They're sometimes called lawyerless courts. They are some of the humans who are using the courts, and they come into what traditionally is a very grand environment with the judge sitting on an elevated bench. It's very intimidating, unfamiliar. They don't know which table is for whom. What range of people who use courtrooms did you consult in the course of this design exercise?
So to give full credit, this was a team of 4 students who dove into this topic, and they really made sure to speak to everyone. I think we had just drafted a paper actually, and in reading through some of the numbers they supplied, 50 interviews, everyone from lawyers to jurors who have been in any jury system, of course, in different states, different cities. The legal staff in the room, we heard from lawyers saying, being a lawyer is tough. Like, we take on all this trauma in the room and we don't always know what to do with it. So how can the room be better for lawyers? And the same thing, how can the witness feel both secure and protected and heard, but also know where they're sitting, know the layout of the room. So their final design actually took all of that into consideration and tried to place everyone sort of on as level of a playing field as possible, while still honoring sort of some of the tradition and some of the delineations that we still expect in a courtroom. For instance, at one of their versions, actually, the judge was on par with everyone else, the same height. And while in one way that sounds amazing, everyone in the room was sort of like, the judge should be a little higher, maybe not, many feet higher, but really we don't want to be sitting next to the judge rubbing elbows. Like that they deserve a little bit different, right? So really it's like, how much do you flatten that hierarchy, and how much do you allow certain rules to still be sort of dictated or expressed in the space? So there's a lot of learning for everyone in that process.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about that process, it was a really cool project from so many angles. So they talked to a number of stakeholders, and then they did have to, like, the issue with the art right? One issue was that the art is bigger than the judges. Another issue is that it's mostly white male. So for a lot of the constituents who are in the court, they don't feel represented. So the idea that I jumped to immediately is like, oh, we should change the art. And what the students ended up doing was changing the layout of the court so that the art was still there, but nobody was looking at it. And I think that's also a testament to like, you can't just go to your first idea. Surprisingly, it's easier to move chairs around than it is to change art in that particular courtroom. And so really having enough ideas that you can kind of run through and say, okay, there's a lot of different ways to address this issue, which is the best way given the context and the resources and the issue that we're trying to address.
Mike and Sarah, had you ever worked with law students before?
No, I have not worked with law students before. I'm looking forward to working with law students in the future, though.
Oh, what was it like?
Well, so these were just for design students. They were not law students, but they
Oh.
very quickly got up to speed on. They did research into traditional courtroom design to alternative courtroom design. So they might not be JDs, but they definitely they've taken 101 for sure.
Very interesting. Any other examples that any of you have about the application of human-centered design outside of technology?
I mean, I can talk about another project that was in a class that Mike and I taught. An organization came to us called Craft Now, which is a local Philadelphia organization who their role is really to promote craft in Philadelphia and especially to expose youth to craft. And they were trying to figure out what the best way to do that is, how to support the existing ecosystem of nonprofit organizations and how to connect with students. And so in this case, our students had kind of two key stakeholders who they were looking at. One was kids in Philadelphia who might be interested in crafting and their families. And then the second is these small crafting organizations who want to engage more with kids, but might not have the operational infrastructure to make that happen. And they had a couple of, I think, critical insights in their project. One was that Craft Now was doing some programming, but when the students laid where the programs were happening with the distribution of kids in Philadelphia, there was a huge mismatch. And so they realized that they really needed to meet the kids where they were, especially when you're talking about something that maybe kids don't even understand all of the ways, and families don't understand all of the ways in which crafting activities can be really good for kids and help them with storytelling and just help them think differently about what's possible in the world. So they had this idea about moving the organizational activities out to where kids are. And then they had some really clear needs for these organizations who could deliver the programming, but just needed help planning, organizing, structuring, and needed help more than just funding. And so the students did a couple of prototypes with families on Zoom doing activities just to learn more about what worked and what didn't work. And they ended up kind of recommending that they do programming where they partner with Philadelphia rec centers all over the city. And they came up with a good process for bringing in these craft organizations into the rec centers to deliver programming to the kids. And so this past summer, Craft Now piloted it with a number of summer camps and I think 8 different craft organizations. And it was one of those things where, like, when I say to you, you need to do the programming where the kids are, you're like, of course they do, but they hadn't thought about it in that way. And so it completely transformed how they approach delivering programming to these kids.
Human-centered design sounds very interdisciplinary. It seems to be about tapping the experience and the expertise of people who know things that you don't know. What other disciplines beyond your own have you worked with on human design projects?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start. The class that I teach is housed out of the School of Nursing, but it's an interdisciplinary course. So we've had students from Penn Vet, we've had Wharton business students, School of Arts, we've had engineers, designers, architecture students, medical students, all coming together working on these design projects. And they all bring a different education, they all bring a different experience and lens that makes these projects much more rich, and the ideas that come out of them are really a lot more fit the solution a lot better. And so I think the whole point of human-centered design, like healthcare, it's a team sport, right? You need all these different players to be able to truly understand the problem and create an accurate solution. And I'll say that, the most important player in this is the person who the problem affects. Human-centered design, in my opinion, also means co-design, having the stakeholders involved from the very beginning, from the empathy phase all the way through to testing and evaluation. It's really critical to have them engaged so that we make sure we're addressing the right problem, creating the right solution, and that the solution works in the environment where the problem is occurring. And so, anytime that I do any sort of innovation project, whether it's in class or out in real life, I make sure that at some point the stakeholder is involved in all these phases as much as possible.
I want to try to connect our discussion to law more directly, and I'm going to ask you an unrehearsed question. One of the problems in law is the complexity of legal process. Complexity of process makes it much more expensive for people who can afford to pay for a lawyer, and it makes the system incomprehensible to people who can't afford to pay for a lawyer. I'll give you a specific example. At least as of a couple of years ago, if you wanted an uncontested divorce in the state courts of New York, you had to file between 12 and 21 different forms, the precise number depending on whether one spouse was seeking support for the other and whether there were children involved. I've looked at the names of the forms that had to be filed. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a New York lawyer. I can't understand the names of some of those forms. Can you give some examples of how human-centered design might help to simplify complicated court processes to make the system less expensive for people who can afford lawyers and more comprehensible to people who don't have lawyers?
I mean, I'll maybe wade in a little bit. I mean, I think a lot of times, right, these systems have been designed over decades, at least. And what tends to happen is things get added and nothing gets taken away. And so I think a lot of times, if I was going to tackle that particular problem from a human-centered design lens, I would start by looking at, okay, who are all the stakeholders and what are the different needs of, the people who are getting divorced, the institutions, the organization, who needs to know what, and almost like go through a process of really try to create the most simplest picture of the system and then map that to the current situation and then try to generate ideas for, how you could simplify. And to Marion's point, I mean, that project works best if you have stakeholders from the various institutions and organizations involved and are there to problem solve with you. This is a little bit of a tangent, but a couple of weeks ago, I was giving a talk about design thinking and human-centered design to different people in the financial services industry, also a complicated industry. And they, of course, we're blaming the lawyers. They're like, our problem is that we can't innovate because the lawyers are always telling us what we can't do. And one of the people in the class stood up and was like, you just have to find the right lawyer. You need to find the person who's going to help you figure out what you can do and not, talk to them first before you talk to the person who tells you what you can't do. So I think the same principles of like teasing apart who are the stakeholders, what are their needs, and then almost starting from scratch to redesign the system. If we designed it today, what would it look like? And then maybe you have to backtrack because you can't make all that change at once. But I do think it's feasible. I mean, Marion is a nurse and works in the healthcare system. Mike and I actually also do a lot of work with if they can do it in hospitals, I feel like lawyers can do it too, because like literally, we're not redesigning surgeries, but we're redesigning everything around those things, which are literally life and death situations. So you just have to kind of tease apart the complexity and start looking at it from different angles.
And I can jump in and just add that, recently I was speaking to one of your colleagues about plain language forms. And my question for him was, how many exist? And basically it varies by everything. Any different variable you could have, there's going to have a different set of forms. And when I asked why that felt like it was happened, he mentioned a sort of trust, like no one understands my neighborhood. No one understands this municipality, right? And I think sort of part of the human-centered design process isn't just coming up with solutions, but it's actually getting people to talk to each other on an even playing field. So if you get, a handful of municipalities in a state together and a handful of the people who actually use these forms, that person who thinks their form has to be this way because it's exactly what they need, if they hear 5 people say, took me 2 hours to fill out, they might not realize it. So it might not even be that they, know the impact down the line, or that their form is very close to the neighboring form, and that actually it could work together and they could work together to make a plain language version. So I think part of the process is, as much as it is about solving, it's actually just about getting everyone together. Again, sort of flattening that hierarchy and just letting all the voices be heard. I think that can apply to any profession.
How to do that. Sarah made the point that these systems, these processes have developed over a long time. What that often means is people have a vested interest in keeping them. They're comfortable with them. Certain people are comfortable with them. How do you overcome that? How do you get innovation adopted? How do you deal with the resistance that people have to change? This is a particular problem in law where the system depends very much on precedent. What's happened before? Doing again what's been done before is considered a good thing. And Mike, the example you gave about getting the people in the room, and when people can hear from one another, hear from people different from themselves, that opens their eyes. But somebody's got to do something to convene that group in the first place, to provide the opportunity for people to hear different perspectives. Do you have any experience in overcoming institutional or personal resistance to innovations?
Yeah, I think in healthcare, there is some resistance to innovation or some resistance to change. And so I think Mike and I are working on a new project at one of the Penn medicine hospitals. And, they just built this brand new emergency department, but their clinicians are having issues with the new design, and it's making their workflow really complicated. And so in order to have the higher level C-suite administrators take their feedback into account to be able to make these changes, they've asked us, 2 of our Penn nursing students and 2 Penn design students, to work with their clinicians to understand the problems and to help them come up with potential solutions that could be implemented in this new building. Now, they spent a lot of time, money, and energy on this new building, and they want to keep their clinicians happy. These clinicians are their main stakeholders outside of their patients. And so I think the point here is that you have to have stakeholder buy-in for needing the changes to the systems that some people may be comfortable with, whether that's your patients, whether that's your clinicians. You need somebody who's going to take ownership and say, we have a problem here, we need to make changes, and then make the effort to do it. So there was one clinician at the hospital who said, this isn't working for us, and we need to branch out, we need to partner with design and engineering to figure out how to make these changes. And he was able to then bring together his leadership and his other clinicians to buy into that. So it's sort of a multi-stepped approach until he got the buy-in he needed. And now we're able to move this project forward. Mike, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
And I just really think, that's why we're all here today, right? It's because you need the new grad, you need the little voice inside the firm that says, this isn't right, something should change. You need the advocates. And I think, again, that's why this whole series is in existence, right? Is really to get those voices out there, the little in their heads, and then see what can happen as more and more and more of these people start having the same ideas that things can and should change. And I think, again, that can happen in any profession. Again, if it can happen in medicine, I can't see how it couldn't happen in, other similarly complex professions.
And I'll just make one other comment. What I'm seeing on the health system side, that it's always from the bottom up. The clinicians see the problems, they want to then create the solutions, and they're the ones who advocate then for the changing of the system or the new product or whatever solution they need. And so, educating the lawyers, educating the physicians and the nurses around these processes and how they can work to better inform their practice, I think is really important and critical. And, I think that's what you're doing at Penn Law. That's what we're doing at Penn Nursing, is to give our clinicians the tools and resources and education they need to then be that voice, be that stakeholder to help improve the system.
That's very much what we're trying to do with the Future of the Profession initiative at the law school. We're trying to educate the next generation of lawyers to think differently about law and to empower them to recognize that even if they're new in the profession, speaking up is really important. They often see the irrationality of the traditional practices. Why are you doing it this way? But they have to feel comfortable saying that if you're going to do anything with the reaction that they have, which makes me wonder, can you teach innovation? Is it something that people either have or they don't? Who takes your courses? Is it a self-selected group that came to you brimming with innovation before they got to you? And how do you reach out to the people who might not be inclined on their own to sign up for what you're doing? What lessons can we apply at the law school from your experience in teaching innovation?
I mean, I think if we couldn't teach innovation, then we would all be charlatans. So let's hope so. I teach these methods, like I teach them to my master's students who are really focused on this. I teach a design thinking class where I get students from the ed school and Wharton and engineering and design. I teach a new class in healthcare innovation. And it is 100% that there's a self-selecting group of people who are somewhat interested in this. But I think it's very teachable. And one of the things I love, especially about the executive education that I do, is these students who take the class learn so much. And then they go out directly to their organizations and they teach it to their colleagues who maybe didn't seek out the class, but they're learning methods, they're learning tools, they're learning an approach to problem solving. So I guess I would say, like, let's go to the people who are interested, but don't necessarily feel like they have the skills, but want the skills. And then we can teach them like really particular skills and methods and tools. And I think by practicing those things, they learned mindsets that they can then share more broadly with their organization.
And I'll say that, we're trying to do the same thing you're doing, right? Teaching the next generation of nurses to be leaders in health and healthcare innovation. And, one course does not make an innovation education program. And so we're really thinking about how we can integrate innovation curriculum throughout the entire educational lifespan, from undergrad students all the way through doctoral students. And so we're infusing this into different undergraduate courses. We've created different innovation design thinking courses for our doctoral students, really just trying to give exposure to these methodologies and this way of thinking early and often, again, throughout the entire nursing educational program, so that, just like Sarah said, the students who took these courses now go out, and a lot of them are practicing clinicians already, and they're going back to their institutions, talking about this new way of thinking, this new way of solving problems, and implementing it out in the health systems that they work in. And so, I'm a firm believer that teaching people how to innovate leads to people innovating. And so the more we expose our students at all levels to this type of education, the more that they will go out and innovate and practice, and that'll sort of spread. And I've seen that just in the few years I've been doing this at Penn Nursing.
I want to ask you about the impact of regulatory environments on innovation. Law is a heavily regulated profession. These complex processes that I talked about, they're dictated by state Supreme Courts and by state legislatures. Lawyers just can't decide that they're going to start over again on their own. Healthcare is regulated, Marion, and even though design might not be regulated, you probably work with clients who deal with regulatory processes, have regulatory barriers. Have you had experience in navigating regulatory obstacles to innovation and particularly to human-centered design? And if so, how have you dealt with them?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, I think just because we're calling something human-centered design, it's very similar to what hospitals have done for decades in terms of evidence-based practice and implementation science and research and development. You know, just because we're calling something human-centered design doesn't mean that it's not methodological, it's not rigorous, and we don't have to go through a system to, you know, test and implement something. So it's similar to the systems we're already doing in the hospitals. And so the regulatory part is already sort of baked into what we usually do, especially around research and development of new drugs and new medical devices. And so I don't have a great example on how it's different for human-centered design, other than it's what we're already doing in the health systems, and we have processes for that already set up. And so once we take something from that early stage prototype to minimally viable products, we're then going into the institutional review board, starting to test that through research processes and moving it from there.
I
don't know, Sarah, if you have.
I guess the other thing that I would say is, like, I don't think human-centered design can solve all of our problems, right? So I think that there's a way of just like adding this to the toolkit, and there are probably certain things that it's like, oh yes, design is the best way to approach this particular issue. And like, you know, rearranging a courtroom, redesigning forms, designing internal processes in law firms, maybe, you know, I don't know enough about the profession to come up with other examples, but then there are other things that are much more systemic and that you do need to go through regulatory avenues. So I think the goal would be to know when you're in which spot, right? Like when do you need to litigate to change something? When do you need to petition? When do you need a new law? And when are there opportunities for tackling a problem or an opportunity with a different tool? So, and I think that's what I've seen happen in healthcare as well, is like, you know, there's a lot of space in terms of like service design, service delivery, experience design for, you know, patients, caretakers, clinicians, anyone in the hospital. And then there's some things that like this process just isn't the best tool for.
A final question for the three of you. It sounds to me as if a successful innovator needs to be able to deal with failure. You're going to design prototypes that turn out not to work. You're going to seek input from the humans that you're designing for, and they're not going to like the direction that you're headed in. And if you're teaching, you're going to have to give constructive criticism about the approach to innovation that your students are taking. Law students are not trained to fail, quite the opposite. This is a human issue, not something that's limited to law students. What is your experience in getting people comfortable with the idea of experimentation and failure, and enabling them to accept feedback that might be hard for them to hear?
Mike, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can just say that, you know, in the IPD program, there are people from design, engineering, and business, right? And most of these people are high achievers who have probably had a lot of success leading up to their time with us. And this might be the first time they're in a studio environment where they are getting critique. So similar to, say, a law student, where this is not a natural process for them. So Sarah and I are working constantly, right, to think about ways that we can provide feedback, structures we can set up in the classroom, norms that we can develop. And I think one of the things, and I know Sarah has a more fleshed out framework than this, but one of the basic things to remember is that the project is not the person. So you need to, everyone in the room needs to understand that if I'm saying that this project needs to be improved this way, or this idea should not be considered because of X, Y, and Z reasons, that doesn't mean that that person did something wrong. I think it was mentioned earlier that, you know, the more ideas, the better ideas. It is really at moments a quantity project. And if everyone can just throw these ideas out into the table and be open to the fact that seeing them, talking about them, they'll evolve into something new. And oftentimes the best idea comes from me sharing my idea with you, you not understanding what I said, you talking it back to me in a slightly different way, which gets someone else in the room to think of it a new way. And then it just goes round and around. And so that person, quote unquote, that person's idea is actually growing through the iterative process. It's growing through critique. It's not, you are wrong, here's your C, go home. It's, oh, this is a cool idea, but I think about it this way, right? And it's building. So I think if you keep that attitude of building and growing as part of critique, it becomes a positive and not a negative.
It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, one of the frameworks we've been working with our students is to think about the kind of feedback you're getting in three ways. Like sometimes it's appreciation, which is tends to be about like effort and approach. And then there's coaching, which is about, you know, the feedback that you need so that you can do a better job next time. And then there's evaluation, which is like, how did you do? And people really need all three of those. The challenge is when they are expecting one and get another, or when they interpret coaching as evaluation, right? Coaching is really about, you know, how do you do better next time? But if I take that as, oh, that was how I did, and it, you know, to Mike's point, like that was about me as a person, not about my approach to this project and how I can't get better. That's, I think, where you get into trouble. But it's hard. And I think really the only way to get used, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I still hate to fail. It hurts a little bit every time. But I think the more times you do it, the more comfortable you get. And so just pushing students out there to like share their ideas before they're fully baked, to try things, they realize so quickly how much they learn through that process that they're more comfortable doing it the next time.
Yeah, and I make sure from almost the first week of class, the students are constantly getting feedback on the work that they're doing. Every class, we do check-ins with the teams, and they're getting feedback from their peers so that it's an ongoing thing that they understand. To Mike's point, it's the product. It's not about you or the work that you've done, but how we can collaboratively make your solution better. And that only comes with feedback, with constant feedback. Sort of a reframing.
Yes. Well, I'd like to open it up for questions. We have some in the Q&A box. Before we do, I want to repeat that the second code for CLE credit is future. Our first question comes from Sandy Ambrosi. She says, while human-centered design is critical, how do we make sure that the outcome is not just to make it easier for a person to navigate a bad system? This is a particular problem in law.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a problem. I mean, I would say that so I talked you through kind of the general parts of a human-centered design process, but there's a model that I've been using lately that I find incredibly valuable that's more focused on liberatory design and design for equity. And a piece of that is really about understanding how whatever it is that you're working in is situated in a system and understanding the impact of the system. And I think that's where it's really important to start to say, like, wait, this is where like we can't just design something small. We really need to be tackling the bigger system. So I think system awareness is the first step. And really understanding, like, you know, maybe it's better to just have someone have a better experience with a bad system as one project, as long as there's another project that's about changing the system, because they're both important.
Yes. Another question, for any given project or problem, how do you decide who to put at the center of your design? For example, a juror, a litigant, a patient, a doctor, administrative staff?
Yeah, so I mean, do you want to take this, Mike?
Go for it, Mary.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it really depends. You know, every problem can have multiple stakeholders and multiple people who it affects, especially in the health system. So if we're working in pediatrics, you know, your stakeholder could be the patient who's a child, your stakeholder could be the parent or guardian, the stakeholder could be the nurse, and not every solution is going to meet all of their different needs. And so you have to decide who you're designing for from the forefront, and then create the solution based on that stakeholder's needs. Now, you can have multiple stakeholders, but you'll have multiple processes that you'll have to go through in order to come up with the right solution for the right population, because not every solution is going to meet everyone's needs. So you just have to figure out who that stakeholder is that you're designing for in that moment. And then, like Sarah said, there's always multiple other projects and processes going on at the same time that you could be designing for.
I was just going to add that, you know, sometimes also at the beginning of a project, you think the stakeholder might be someone, right? That the client says, this is our problem, this is what we need you to figure out. And going through the process, you actually uncover the fact that that problem can be solved by actually going somewhere else, looking somewhere else, or maybe that's not the core problem once you've talked to enough people. So I think the idea of designing for a stakeholder is it shifts over time. And part of the design process is actually to have that open mind, to understand that it's not set at the beginning, but again, it follows the research.
It can be multiple humans you're designing for in different positions. How can people from different professional backgrounds communicate and cooperate effectively? We're talking here about interdisciplinary approaches to things. And the questioner says, people in different fields have different language and different ways of thinking. Have you had experience with, or have you faced challenges in communicating across disciplines with people who don't bring your mindset to the problem you're trying to solve?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because right now, that project Mary mentioned earlier with the 2 nursing students and the 2 design students, you know, one of the design students said to me, you know, it's amazing to be able to work with this content expert, right? This nursing student is asking questions I would never have thought to ask. They're 4 steps ahead of me in this way, while maybe the design student's 4 steps ahead of them in another way, right? So right off the bat, if you can actually get people in the room and understand that there is a language learning opportunity, and that basically spending the time in the same place, talking to the same people, you gain that appreciation for what the other one knows, you pick up some language along the way, and then you can keep going from there. But I think it's really, again, that idea of being open to the fact that your profession does not have the answers, and that by understanding someone else deeply, or their profession and their practice deeply, you get a better end product.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I was going to add, which just is an emphasis on what you're saying, Mike, is if you have an interdisciplinary team, or even team from the same discipline, but coming from 4 different organizations trying to work on the same project, there's like an empathy building phase that has to happen internally with the team, where you all start to understand each other and what everybody cares about and what everybody's talking about a little bit.
I'll just give an example. This was probably a few years now. I had a group of students. They were nursing students and architecture students, and they were working on this project together. And neither student had ever interacted in any sort of coursework with each other. And it took a little while for them to get used to each other's style. The architecture student, you know, they were very visual. They had to draw things out and really sketch out what the design was going to be. And the nurses were very process oriented. And it was fascinating watching them work together and develop over the course of this semester, and get to a point where they were using each other's skills in a way that they never could have had they not been working through this process in that way in class. Like Mike said, like communicating and just being together. They came up with such an incredible product that never could have happened had they not been on the same team together, not brought those different skill sets to the class. So it's a really, it's a fascinating way to look at a problem when you can do it through these different interdisciplinary lenses.
It's really interesting. How long did it take for them to get to that breakthrough point where they began to get it and be able to talk to each other?
Yeah, I mean, it was like weeks. I would say like, this was a couple years ago now. So I would say it's probably like four or 5 weeks. Somewhere before the middle of the semester, I saw the light bulb go off and they were, working together, flowing together as a cohesive team.
We have a question from Joe Lincoln. He says, I'm not sure that this discussion has addressed yet the issue of dealing with the person who has a vested interest in the status quo. For example, the lawyer who gets more fees from a complex system, not just matters of habit, comfort, and precedent. There's a financial interest in preserving the status quo. Any experience in dealing with that and overcoming it?
I mean, I'll say I've experienced it. I've yet to overcome it. So if anybody has any ideas, I'm all ears.
I'm trying to think of, well, I don't know if this is quite, I think this starts to get there. A couple of years ago, I did a project with folks from the Department of Medicine at HUP around faculty well-being. And I was working basically with the people who run operations, and they were trying to understand how to, help their doctors avoid burnout. Basically, it's a big problem industry-wide. And I will say, like, these are the the people who are responsible for the bottom line of the organization. And one of the first things I decided to approach the project, like, I'm not going to do all the empathy building work, you guys are. So they went out and shadowed physicians and spent a day with them, spent a morning with them. One of them actually fainted. One of them almost fainted because they were so overwhelmed by like the operating room in one case. And in another case, just the emotional content of dealing with patients and patient care. And I have to say that by the end, they had so much more empathy with their faculty that at the beginning they were like, oh, maybe we need to have dry cleaning on site and provide meals. And at the end, they said, I think we really need to relook at how we account for revenue and change our RVU structure. So I do think that, of course, this wasn't like an individual's bottom line, but it was the organization's bottom line. And I do think that empathy for other people in the system can go a long way towards pushing change. I think the other thing that can go a long way towards pushing change is like the opposite, which is like threat of the risk of not changing. So if you start to see how the world is changing around you and you're either going to be left behind or you're going to catch up, maybe you're motivated by fear to try and catch up and change. So I think it depends on the context and the situation, but I do think there's ways through the process that people can change their attitude and approach.
I've actually had some experience myself with this issue in the legal profession. And the solution has to be getting other people at the table, not just hearing the voices of the people who have a personal financial stake in the status quo. And the best example I can think of is regulatory reform. For example, to permit paralegals, people who are not lawyers, to function in the way that physician's assistants and nurse practitioners and medical technicians function in healthcare, where they're not doctors, but they can provide healthcare. We have nothing similar in law, except in a few states that have introduced the concept of sort of tiered service providers who are licensed, regulated, and trained to provide services that previously only lawyers could provide. And the difference where that's happened, it's been because change was led by the state Supreme Court. Often the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court or an individual judge or justice who used the platform that they had, who saw how the system isn't working and were willing to take on the bar and say, thank you, we've heard your comments and we're going to go ahead. So I think it's a leadership challenge in identifying the people who have the power and the inclination to overcome the resistance that you get from the vested status quo. You have to think about getting the issue out of their hands alone. Who else can be an ally in making change happen? Well, I think we have covered our 3 goals here. I think you've explained what human-centered design is and how it applies to many kinds of problems. We've explored the interdisciplinary nature of human-centered design, and we've sure identified challenges to the adoption of human-centered design across industries, but we've also identified ways to overcome them. Thank you so much, Sarah and Marion and Mike. This has been a great discussion. I'd like to turn it back to Jen.
Thank you so much, Jim, for facilitating and leading this wonderful conversation. We're so grateful to our terrific colleagues and friends from around Penn's campus. They've been so helpful to us as we've built FPI, and we'll continue learning from them and looking forward to collaborating with them. We hope you'll join us for the next 2 sessions in our Spring Learning from Others series. On April 12th, our colleague John Holloway, who is a senior fellow at Penn's Positive Psychology Center, will moderate a conversation about what we can learn from other disciplines about health and well-being of our colleagues and employees. And on April 26th, Tiffany Sutherland, a graduate of the law school and director of diversity at the law firm of Troutman Pepper, will lead a conversation about what we can learn from others about promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our profession. I'd also like to close by thanking Naoshi Giles from the Law School's Conferences and Events Department for coordinating today's program, as well as Dalila Lewis, FPI's administrative coordinator. We're grateful to both of you. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. We hope you stay safe, that you are well, and we look forward to seeing you next time.